Hello and welcome to MIP TV, and with me is Bob Cook, who is a transactional analyst, someone who works, trains, and in fact delivers therapy in transactional analysis. And we're going to talk in TA Made Simple about functional analysis. So Bob, what is functional analysis?
Okay, so the major concept that Eric Berne is famous for, and is really the whole, well, it's a canon of TA. He talks about it avidly in his book Transactional Analysis Psychotherapy. It's the idea of PAC, a theory of personality, which we talked about in the last Made Simple concept video. After that, he then invented, created, wrote about another model of ego states, which is called functional model of ego states, and he wrote about that in 1961 in his book in Transactional Analysis. Now, in the last snippet of I think it was 2 weeks ago when I produced that actual video on structural analysis, I was talking about that in terms of personality. Now, this particular model is basically a model of behaviors, as opposed to the structural model, which is about how you became the way you are. So an analogy would be the structural model. You're looking at the parent and how that came about. You looked at the child ego state, how that came about. It's a bit like, going to open the bonnet of a car and you know where the carburetor is, you know where the oil filter is, etc., etc. Then you put the keys in and it functions. So the functional model is the behaviors that you see. So that it's the external manifestation of internal phenomena. So it's the behaviors that you would see if you watched, I don't know, a therapy session or whatever. You would see the behaviors. Yeah. Whereas what I was talking about 2 weeks ago in the structural model, it was the internal phenomenal, which was happening in the internal world.
Right. So one's the internal and one's external.
Correct. So the behaviors are external. It's
so
how we function.
So what kind of behaviors would we, if we were kind of sat in a room observing a TA therapy session, how would we identify those behaviors? What would they look like?
Well, he split these ego states into 5, and he called them nurturing parent behaviors, controlling parent behaviors, often changed in the books to critical parent, but he called it controlling parent, free child behaviors, adapted child behaviors. So you just said what I said. So nurturing parent behaviors would be things like, you could say verbally, you should be doing this, you ought to be doing this, you must be doing that from the parent, but you might say it in a nurturing way, for example. Or if you want more classical examples of nurturing parent behavior, it would be things, oh, I really like you today, oh, it's really nice to see you, oh, please, it would be have a nurturing quality to it. So your voice tone would go down, it would be warmer, and it wouldn't have that, harshness of the controlling parent. It would be nurturing, as if you were nurturing a youngster in a way.
Yes. Yeah. So if a therapist saw that being presented in a client, how may they kind of work with that?
Well, the positive side of nurturing parent, they probably wouldn't work with so much, of course, because that's the base of self-esteem. But if you think of the negative side of parent, the parent behaviors, that would be things like overwhelming, and it would be things like, I'll give you a case, I'll make one up. 40-year-old guy comes for therapy and he says, I'm having problems with relationship, and then he's only had 4 or 5 in his life, didn't last very long, and you ask him about his parent, his parents, for example, and then he says, oh yes, I still live at home, and do you know, I'm a teacher, and my mother, he talked about his mother gets up early and gets the shirts ironed, and on Tuesday makes sure that he's got his sandwiches ready and irons his ties. And he says, well, and even, if I do get some girlfriends, she has to vet them.
Ah, yes.
So you've got overwhelming, smothering type of nurturing behavior, which doesn't allow him to grow up.
Yes.
doesn't allow him any opportunity about his own truth, so he stays young. So he picks relationships with people from a very young position.
Yes. Yeah, and of course, I guess that if someone's looking for a relationship, he wants a relationship with an adult, not a child.
Yeah, not a sort of like an infantilized position.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
So what that person will do is project onto the therapist that they're going to take care of them. And what would happen was that he would have to do quite a lot of therapy about growing up and challenging the therapist properly.
Yes. Yes, and we do see that. I don't want to give specific cases, but there are. I know I'm a humanistic therapy. I'm a person-centered therapist primarily, and we do see clients who, want to look after you as opposed to look after themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we go down to the adapted child behaviours, that other part of the model, that would be what you would see is a client, if we talk clinically again, perhaps have excessive pleasing behaviours, or excessive trying hard behaviours, or excessive please others behaviours, or excessive being strong behaviours. You see this over adaptation to the therapist all the time, rather than coming from an adult place.
Yeah.
So you see these types of behaviours from the different parts of them, which is what he called the functional model.
Yes. Which is being in different ego states, and I guess that the goal of TA therapy is to strengthen the adult ego state. So in cases like that, what I'm guessing that on the therapist's mind would be what intervention to use to get to that place where the client could reinforce and strengthen the adult here and now persona, really.
Yeah, and they'd really have to change their program at a structural level. In other words, what's the unconscious motivations behind the behaviors? So you'd have to go in that level, and then as they started to heal those parts of themselves, the behaviors would change.
Yes.
Because they would have be strengthened their adult ego state. So actually the therapy is, you're quite right, might be strengthening the adult ego state. And once they do that and work out the child hurts, the behaviors might well change. So that's where in another video I was talking about egograms, where you actually do an egogram of the different behaviors. So you look at the energy spent in one of those behaviors, and then if you put energy into another set of behaviors, then you'd get more strength in the adult. So that is what you're going to do. You're going to identify the behaviors. We're going to look for the problem and attempt to get a more even spread of behaviors, if you like, within the functional model, instead of this, lots of behaviors on nurturing parent.
Sure.
Negative. So you're looking at the behaviors.
And it's interesting because I think if I'm correct, Burns said that a healthy kind of adult position is to move through a lot of the ego states.
Yeah. And so not get stuck in one behavioral approach.
Yeah.
And of course, what I do like about the functional model is when I work with couples.
Oh, of course, yes.
Because I can see how you've got interlocking behaviors there. And if you can help teach them to reduce certain behaviors, then you can get a real picture of where you're going with couples.
Yes, and that's all about communication and how people receive communication. I suppose if you have someone who comes across as a dominant parent, then the temptation may be to retreat into being an adaptive or even a free child.
Yeah, absolutely. And conferences and TA conferences I've talked about, and they might talk, you're stuck in your nurturing parent, you're stuck in your controlling parent, or you're stuck infantilized and you're adapted. And I don't really like that type of, colloquial speaking, but it sort of shows the problems that some people might have in terms of their expressing their behaviors, if you like.
Yes. And I think, I think what it does highlight is a very important kind of difference between TA therapists maybe and people in the humanistic world is that a TA therapist is alerted to looking for a pattern of behaviours that could have caused the client difficulties within that kind of functional model. Someone who's, you know, critical parent, or someone who is a free child all the time, and working with that. And I'm guessing, Bob, that to do that effectively, there has to be some inquiry into the person's history.
Oh, yes. And that's what I'm saying. You cannot really do in-depth clinical work without using the structural model. You have to depart from the functional model. I mean, you can trace the behaviors back to how they become the way they are. That's useful. But you have to look at their history, really, so they can start, you know, healing at a historical level. And then, of course, the behaviors will change.
Yes.
That way round.
Yeah, as Søren Kierkegaard famously said, I may be paraphrasing Søren, but he said, you know, for us to kind of consider our lives, we have to view our lives backwards, but we have to live it forwards. And I think that's a great kind of axiom for therapy. You know, we look backwards to see how we've got to where we are, but we develop and use the therapy to move forwards.
Yeah, no, but you're quite right. You said many times, I was probably the first CBT therapist, or an early one, and this is a behavioural model.
Yeah.
And his ideas were that if you change the cognitive and behavioural levels, then the rest would follow. I don't actually really think so. I think you need to go to look at the history and the emotions.
Yes. I suppose for brief treatments that could be useful, but for long-term healing, you really do need to, you know, it's a bit like, you know, if you have weeds, isn't it? You can take the top off the weed and keep doing that, but the root is still there. You know, to get rid of the weed, you really have to dig in and get the root out. It's a gardening analogy. I'm not sure how accurate it is, but
very good one, that
makes sense to me. Yeah, you have to get the
weeds are at the structural level.
Yeah,
absolutely. You know, the depth.
Yeah.
So you have to go to the structural level.
So that is a really interesting kind of exploration of not only the functional model, but actually how a therapist would work with it and be attuned to where the client is, you know, developmentally. And as always, Bob Cook, thank you very much.
Thank you.